The world had already crumbled when Lucas reached the outskirts of the city. What had once been a vibrant, thriving metropolis now lay in ruins, abandoned buildings, abandoned streets, and an eerie silence that only seemed to deepen as the sun dipped lower behind the horizon. He was one of the lucky few, an anomaly, a survivor in a world where survival had become a cruel lottery. The infection had spread rapidly, and within weeks, civilization had fallen into chaos. Now, there was only one hope left, the sanctuary. A rumored safe haven hidden somewhere deep in the mountains, shielded by barricades, reinforced walls, and a group of survivors who had managed to outlast the storm. It was all anyone could talk about, and Lucas had decided to take a chance. His survival had not been easy. Each day had been a battle for food, water, and shelter, all while avoiding the undead that had once been human, family members, friends, neighbors, now twisted into mindless predators that tore apart anything that moved. He had learned the hard way not to trust anyone he met on the road, as desperation had turned too many into monsters far worse than the zombies. He'd seen the devastation firsthand, men and women who would once have helped others and now only sought to take what they could. The end of civilization had brought out the very worst in people. But there was still hope, a distant, fading light that burned in the form of the sanctuary. Lucas moved carefully through the ruins of the city, navigating the dark alleys and avoiding the wandering undead. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sounds of groaning and shuffling echoed from every corner. Every footstep felt like a risk, but he had no choice. He had to get to the outskirts before the dead closed in on him. His ears were constantly on alert, listening for any hint of movement, any sign that the infected were nearby. His hand gripped the crowbar tightly, his weapon of choice. It was crude but effective, and it had served him well over the past several months. The sharp metal felt reassuring in his grip as he moved further into the heart of the city. He had no intention of staying here long. He had heard rumors of an undead horde migrating through this area, and he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The sanctuary was just a few days' journey away, but the road ahead was anything but certain. A sound caught his attention, the faint shuffle of feet on concrete. He froze, his body tense as his eyes scanned the surroundings. Nothing. Then, the unmistakable guttural groan of the undead pierced the silence. A single zombie appeared from around the corner, its decayed body dragging itself forward with slow, deliberate steps. Lucas knew he had to act fast. He ducked behind a broken-down car, praying the creature hadn't seen him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he waited for the right moment to strike. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, the zombie shuffled closer, its face a grotesque mask of death. It was only a few feet away when Lucas moved. He lunged from his hiding place, the crowbar swinging through the air in a precise arc. The metal collided with the side of the undead's skull with a sickening crack, sending it crashing to the ground. Its body twitched once, then lay still. Lucas took a moment to steady himself, his heart racing. The encounter had been close, but it was a small victory in a war that seemed endless. His eyes scanned the streets once more, then turned his attention to the horizon. The sanctuary wasn't far, but getting there was the true test. In a world filled with death, the only thing that mattered was survival, and Lucas was determined to make it to the last safe haven before the undead consumed the world whole. As he pushed forward, the faint glow of the setting sun bathed the broken city in a dim light, and for the first time in months, Lucas allowed himself a fleeting sense of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but the sanctuary was still out there, and with it, the promise of safety. The days blurred together as Lucas trekked through the devastated landscape, his mind only focused on one thing, reaching the sanctuary. The rumors spoke of a place untouched by the undead, a refuge where humanity could start anew. But Lucas knew better than to trust mere hearsay. After all, people lied in these desperate times. Trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and the more people he met, the less he had to give. Still, he clung to the belief that somewhere, out there, hope still existed. The path took him through small towns ravaged by both the undead and other survivors. It was clear that the horde had passed through these areas, leaving behind only death and destruction in its wake. He passed through a burned-out gas station, its pumps shattered, the metal signs now rusted and twisted. The town square was eerily quiet, the once bustling hub now nothing more than an empty shell. He'd seen this before, the broken remnants of the old world. It was as if time itself had stopped. On the second day of his journey, Lucas encountered his first real challenge, a group of survivors. They were holed up in an abandoned farmhouse, hiding from the undead that had overrun their last safe haven. They hadn't seen him yet, and Lucas was weighing his options. He had learned the hard way not to approach groups of strangers without caution. The desperate ones were the most dangerous. He watched them for hours, analyzing their movements and listening to their conversations. There were 5 in total, 2 men, a woman, and 2 children. The woman appeared to be the leader, organizing the others and giving them tasks. She seemed strong, but there was something in her eyes that told Lucas she was struggling to maintain control. At dusk, Lucas made his decision. He would approach them cautiously, offering his help rather than demanding it. If they turned him away, he would have no choice but to keep moving. If they welcomed him, he would stick around long enough to see if they were trustworthy. As night fell and the survivors gathered around a small fire in the barn, Lucas stepped out from the shadows. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I've been on the road for days, looking for the sanctuary. I could use some help. Water, food, maybe some company." The group tensed immediately, their hands instinctively moving toward weapons. The woman, who had been sitting on a crate, stood up slowly, sizing Lucas up. "You think we've got food to share?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "What do you offer in return?" "I can protect you," Lucas said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I've fought my way through a lot of these things already. I've got skills." The woman studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right. But we'll need to know more than that. You've got a name?" "Lucas," he replied. "Catherine," she said. "And these are the others, Mark, Rachel, and the kids, Ethan and Lily." She paused, her gaze never leaving him. "You stay for one night. If you're useful, we'll talk about the next step." Lucas nodded, accepting the terms. He sat down by the fire, watching them eat a sparse meal of beans and stale bread. The kids, though they tried to act brave, were clearly scared of the undead, but also of the world they now lived in. Lucas felt a pang of guilt for them, knowing they had no idea what had truly been lost. As the night wore on, Lucas kept his eyes open, scanning the dark horizon. He couldn't afford to relax, not in a world like this. The undead never slept, and neither could he. The hours passed slowly. Just as he was beginning to think the night might be uneventful, the unmistakable sound of distant groaning reached his ears. The undead were getting closer. His pulse quickened as he signaled Catherine. Without a word, she moved toward the others, and Lucas stood, ready to act. This was what it meant to survive, always ready, always alert. And as the first of the undead shuffled into view, Lucas gripped his crowbar tightly and prepared to fight once more. The road to the sanctuary had just gotten a lot more dangerous. The horde arrived faster than Lucas had anticipated. The groans of the undead grew louder as the first few appeared from behind a row of broken-down vehicles. Slowly, they crept into view, their gnarled hands reaching out, dragging their rotting bodies across the ground. Lucas counted at least a dozen of them, but he knew it wouldn't be long before more followed. The smell of death, a sickly, putrid stench, reached his nose, causing his stomach to twist in disgust. "Catherine," Lucas whispered urgently, "we've got company. Get the kids inside, now." She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the children by the arms, pulling them toward the barn's back entrance, her face grim but resolute. Mark and Rachel were already moving, weapons in hand, as they prepared to fend off the horde. Lucas could see the fear in their eyes, but there was no time to dwell on it. The undead were closing in fast. He took a deep breath, his grip tightening around the crowbar. As the first zombie lunged at him, its hands reaching for his throat, he swung with all his strength, the metal striking its skull with a sickening crack. The creature fell to the ground, twitching, its life snuffed out in an instant. But there was no time to celebrate. More were coming. Mark raised his rifle and fired, the loud crack of gunfire echoing in the night. One of the zombies dropped, but the others didn't slow down. They shuffled forward, their groans filling the air like a chorus of the damned. Rachel swung a makeshift spear, catching one of them in the chest and driving it into the dirt. It didn't stop. They never stopped. Lucas moved swiftly, methodically. He slammed the crowbar into another zombie's skull, watching its body collapse in a heap at his feet. But for every one he killed, 2 more took its place. The battle was becoming a blur, swinging, striking, retreating, his mind focused solely on survival. But then something changed. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The unmistakable sound of shuffling feet grew louder, and the undead seemed to multiply with every passing second. Lucas's heart skipped a beat as he realized that this was no ordinary horde. This was a full-on wave, an entire swarm of the undead closing in on them from every direction. "We need to move," Lucas shouted over the chaos, his voice hoarse with panic. "This barn won't hold." Catherine, who had managed to get the kids into a back room, reappeared, her face pale. "What do we do? There's too many of them." "There's only one option," Lucas said, his voice grim. "We fight our way out. Head for the tree line. If we can make it there, we might stand a chance." Mark nodded, his face set with determination. "Let's do it. We don't have a choice." The survivors rallied, ready to make their stand. They fought their way out of the barn, pushing through the mass of undead, their weapons flashing in the moonlight. Lucas felt the weight of each swing, the crushing reality that they couldn't keep this up forever. The undead weren't tiring, but they were. His muscles ached, his breath came in shallow gasps, but still, he pressed on, determined to protect the others. Just as they reached the edge of the barnyard, Lucas heard a scream. He spun around, his heart racing. One of the children, Ethan, had stumbled behind, too slow to keep up. A zombie had grabbed him by the ankle, dragging him toward the ground. "No!" Lucas yelled, rushing back, his crowbar raised high. Without thinking, he swung it down with all his strength. The metal collided with the zombie's head, sending it crashing to the earth. But it was too late. Ethan was already on the ground, blood oozing from a gash on his leg. "Help him!" Catherine screamed, her voice breaking as she rushed to her son's side. Mark and Rachel quickly joined her, lifting Ethan and trying to carry him, but the undead were closing in fast. Lucas didn't have time to process the horror of what had just happened. His mind was focused only on the survival of the group. They couldn't stop. Not now. With the horde closing in, they pushed forward, moving as quickly as they could through the darkened woods, the sounds of the undead echoing behind them. They were running out of time, and Lucas knew it. They weren't going to make it much longer if they didn't find a place to hole up, and fast. The faint light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the survivors as they pushed on. But with the horde on their tail, they knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The early morning light was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it illuminated the path ahead, offering a glimpse of safety in the form of the dense woods. But on the other hand, it gave the undead more visibility of their movement. Lucas kept his eyes darting between the shadows of the trees and the group behind him, his pulse racing. Ethan's labored breathing still echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The boy's leg wound was serious, and there was no telling how long they could outrun the horde. "We need to find shelter," Lucas muttered to Catherine, his voice tight with urgency. "If we stop moving for too long, they'll catch up." Catherine nodded, her face pale but resolute. She was a mother, and her focus had shifted entirely to protecting her children. She gripped Ethan tightly, but her eyes betrayed her worry. Lucas could see that she was pushing herself beyond her limits. Her strength was admirable, but it wouldn't last forever. Mark, Rachel, and the others were already scanning the woods for any sign of a safe haven. They moved quickly, too quickly for the heavy weight of fear that threatened to drag them down. Lucas had been in this situation before. He'd seen people break under the pressure. Desperation was a dangerous thing, and he had no intention of letting it consume them. A few hundred yards ahead, he spotted an old, abandoned cabin nestled between two large oaks. It was a small structure, dilapidated and worn down by years of neglect, but it would do. Lucas gestured for the group to follow him, his eyes never leaving the woods behind them. "We make it to that cabin, we fortify the door, and we rest," Lucas said, his tone firm. "No one falls behind." They pushed forward, the cabin now within reach. As they neared it, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air was too still, the trees too quiet. The normal sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, were absent. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. "Get inside!" Lucas barked, his instincts on high alert. The survivors rushed to the door, forcing it open with a loud creak. They spilled inside, their hearts pounding as the silence of the cabin surrounded them. The interior was dark and musty, the smell of mold filling the air. Dust hung thick in the corners, and the floorboards groaned with every step they took. But it was a roof over their heads, and for now, that was all that mattered. Lucas immediately moved to the windows, peering out through the cracked panes. The undead had not yet followed them into the woods, but they were close, too close. The thought of fighting through the horde again made his stomach turn. They couldn't afford to keep moving like this, not with Ethan's injury slowing them down. "We've got a few hours at most before they reach us," Lucas said, turning back to the group. "We need to find a way to secure the place." Mark and Rachel immediately began pushing furniture in front of the door, doing their best to barricade it. Catherine sat on the floor, cradling Ethan's leg in her lap, her face twisted in pain as she tried to stop the bleeding. Lucas knelt beside them, tearing a strip of cloth from his shirt and tying it tightly around Ethan's wound. "Stay with us, Ethan," Lucas said softly. "We're not going to let anything happen to you." The boy, his face pale and sweating, nodded weakly, his eyes fluttering. But Lucas wasn't sure how much longer they could keep up the facade of safety. Every moment that passed, he could hear the sound of the undead growing nearer. He stood up, scanning the cabin again. There was no way to know how long they could stay here, no way of knowing if they could hold off an attack. He had to think. There had to be something else. Then he saw it, a rusty ladder leading up to a loft. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to give them some time. "We're going to the loft," Lucas decided, his voice sharp. "Get the kids up there. It's safer." Catherine didn't argue. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude but also exhaustion. She and Mark helped Ethan to his feet, supporting him as they made their way toward the ladder. As they climbed, Lucas looked out the window one last time. The trees beyond the cabin were still silent, but he could feel the presence of the undead, lurking just out of sight. They would be here soon. The only question was how long they would last before the walls came down around them. From the loft, Lucas could see the entire perimeter of the cabin. The trees swayed in the wind, but the dead were nowhere to be seen. It was a temporary reprieve, but they needed more. They needed a plan. "We'll stay here for now," Lucas said, his voice low but determined. "But this won't hold forever. We need to figure out where to go next." But as he settled in beside Catherine, watching the others try to catch their breath, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. The undead were closing in, and there was only one place left to go, the sanctuary, and it felt more like a dream with every passing hour. Hours passed in tense silence, the kind that settles deep into your bones and refuses to leave. From the loft, Lucas kept watch, his eyes trained on the trees beyond the cabin. The sound of his breathing, shallow and uneven, was the only thing breaking the stillness. Catherine sat beside him, her hands wringing the fabric of her shirt as she watched over her children. Ethan had finally fallen asleep, though his face was pale, his legs still wrapped in a makeshift bandage. She had yet to let go of the child, her eyes constantly checking for signs of danger. Mark and Rachel sat near the door, talking in low voices. The faint glow of the fading sun filtered through the grimy windows, casting long shadows over the cabin's interior. Outside, the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves reminded them that the undead were still out there, waiting for their next move. "We can't stay here forever," Mark muttered as he adjusted his grip on his rifle. "The barricade won't hold if they come in full force." Lucas nodded, his mind already turning over their options. The sanctuary, the place that had become their final hope, was still a long way off, and their current location wasn't going to protect them for much longer. Every instinct told him that the undead wouldn't give up so easily, they never did. And the longer they remained in one place, the greater the risk of being found. They had no choice but to move, even if it meant risking everything. "We'll have to make it through the night," Lucas said quietly. "If we can hold out until morning, we can move while it's still dark. We'll head east, there's a river about 10 miles out. We can use it as a natural barrier to throw them off our trail." Catherine looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "And after that? What then?" "We're running out of options, Lucas. Running out of time." Lucas met her gaze, knowing that the unspoken question hung heavily in the air. What would they do when they reached the sanctuary? Would it be a place of refuge, or would it turn out to be nothing more than another mirage in the wasteland? The fear of false hope had taken root in his chest, but he couldn't afford to show it. "Not now. We make it there, we fight for it," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence he wished it had. "It's our only shot." Nightfall crept in like a shroud, the darkness descending over them like a suffocating blanket. The undead were still out there, roaming the woods, but there was no way of knowing just how close they were. For a time, the world seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind, set their nerves on edge. It was Rachel who broke the silence, her voice quiet but urgent. "We can't just keep waiting for them to find us. We should make a run for it now." Lucas shook his head. "It's too risky. We need the cover of darkness. Otherwise, we'll be sitting ducks." Mark glanced out the window, his jaw clenched tight. "I don't know, man. We might not have a choice." The sound of shuffling feet outside startled them all, and for a moment, everything stopped. Time itself seemed to freeze as Lucas's heart raced. He motioned for everyone to be quiet, his eyes wide with fear. The cabin had fallen silent once more, save for the sound of his breath and the rapid beat of his pulse. The undead were here. They were close. Lucas moved to the window, peering through the cracks in the boards. He could barely make out the figures moving in the shadows. At first, there was just one, a lone zombie, stumbling slowly through the trees. But then there were two, then three, and the numbers quickly grew. The groans and moans of the undead echoed through the woods, the sound low but unmistakable. A horde was on the move, and they were closing in. "They're coming," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Get ready." Panic flickered in the eyes of the others, but Lucas didn't allow himself to be swept up in it. This was their moment to act. They had one chance, one shot to make it out alive. "Gather everything you can. Weapons, food, supplies," Lucas ordered, his voice sharp. "We need to move fast. We're leaving, now." Mark and Rachel sprang into action, grabbing what they could and securing their gear. Catherine, still holding Ethan, looked at Lucas, her face a mixture of disbelief and determination. "Are we really doing this?" "We have no choice," he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "We fight our way out, or we die here." There was no time to waste. They had no more room for hesitation. The undead were already near the cabin, their slow but relentless shuffle growing louder with each passing second. "We head for the east side," Lucas said. "Once we break through, we head for the river. We stay quiet and keep moving. Stick together, and we make it." One by one, they moved toward the back door. The weight of the moment pressed on Lucas, the uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawing at him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to let fear control him now. The sanctuary was still out there, and it was their only chance. With a final glance at the approaching horde, Lucas opened the door and led the group into the night. It was time to move, time to fight for their survival. The cabin would be lost. But as long as they kept moving, as long as they stayed together, there was still hope. The night air was cold, and Lucas could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him as he led the group away from the cabin. The darkness of the woods was thick, and the trees loomed like silent sentinels, offering little comfort against the growing threat of the undead. Every step felt heavier than the last, but they had no choice but to move forward. The horde wasn't far behind. Lucas's mind raced as he led them through the dense underbrush, his senses sharpened. The groans of the undead echoed faintly behind them, their relentless pursuit making every shadow seem like an immediate threat. The moonlight, though a guide in the otherwise pitch-black forest, only highlighted their vulnerability. They weren't moving fast enough, and Lucas knew it. Behind him, Catherine struggled to keep Ethan on his feet. The boy's leg wound had slowed them down significantly, and Lucas could hear the faint sound of his painful breathing, his steps faltering with every move. Catherine was exhausted, but she kept her composure, her focus entirely on her son. There was no room for weakness. Not now. We can't keep this pace, Mark whispered urgently, his voice tense with fear. We need to find shelter, somewhere we can fortify. Lucas shook his head, his jaw clenched. No. The river is our best chance. It's still a few miles away, but we make it there, we can find a place to hide and regroup. They pressed on, the sound of their hurried footsteps and ragged breathing the only noise in the otherwise still night. Rachel kept glancing over her shoulder, her rifle ready, her expression hard. She was scanning the trees for any sign of movement, ready to protect the group if the undead found them. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the group pushed through the forest, the constant tension eating away at them. Ethan's breathing was growing more shallow, and Catherine's grip on him was beginning to weaken. She stopped for a moment, her face pale and stricken with fear. We can't keep going like this, she whispered, her voice shaking. He's losing too much blood. We need to stop. Lucas knelt beside them, his eyes scanning the woods. We'll make it. The river's just ahead. But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if they would make it in time. The urgency in his voice was as much for himself as it was for her. The fear that had been buried deep inside him was creeping up, and the weight of their situation was almost too much to bear. Suddenly, a distant groan broke through the air, sharp and unmistakable. Then another. And another. The sound of the undead had grown closer. It wasn't just one or two anymore. It was the unmistakable shuffle of a growing horde. We need to go, now. Lucas shouted, his voice desperate. He grabbed Ethan from Catherine's arms, holding him close despite the boy's protests. Mark and Rachel moved quickly, pushing through the brush with grim determination. But even as they rushed, the groaning of the undead behind them seemed to get louder, as if the forest itself were closing in around them. Finally, through the trees, Lucas saw it, the river. Its dark waters flowed with a steady current, a potential lifeline in the distance. He had to get them there. They had to make it to the water. They could lose the horde if they could just get far enough. But before they could reach the river's edge, a scream shattered the night. Catherine. She had been caught off guard, slipping behind the group as they hurried toward the water. One of the undead had reached out from the shadows and grabbed her by the arm, dragging her down to the ground. Her scream cut through the air, but the others couldn't afford to stop. The horde was closing in too quickly. Catherine. Lucas yelled, but he didn't stop running. He couldn't. She fought, struggling against the grip of the creature, her face contorted in terror as the undead closed in. It was too late. Her screams faded as the group pressed on, the distance between them and the chaos widening. Lucas's heart shattered, but there was no time to mourn. He had to keep moving. The river was mere yards away now. They made it to the water's edge, the rush of the current filling their ears as they stopped to catch their breath, their chests heaving with exhaustion. The water was dark and cold, its surface shimmering in the faint light of the moon. "We can't stay here," Mark said, his eyes darting nervously between the trees. "We need to cross, get to the other side. It's our only chance." Lucas nodded grimly. "It's risky, but we don't have a choice. We cross." They waded into the water, the cold biting at their skin as they crossed to the other side. The current was stronger than Lucas had expected, making the crossing more difficult than it should have been. But they made it, every last one of them, soaked to the bone and shivering with cold and fear. On the other side of the river, they stopped. The night felt quieter here, but the fear still lingered. The horde had been left behind, for now. They had survived, but at what cost? Lucas looked at the exhausted, broken faces of the survivors, Mark, Rachel, and Ethan. He felt the weight of it all, Catherine's sacrifice, their near-death escape, the uncertain future ahead. "Tomorrow, we find the sanctuary," Lucas whispered, his voice heavy with resolve. "We make it through this, or we die trying." And as the group began to move through the wilderness once more, Lucas couldn't help but wonder if salvation would really be found at the end of this road, or if the last safe haven was nothing but another myth, another false hope. But it didn't matter. They had come this far. And as long as they still had breath in their bodies, they would keep fighting. The road ahead was dark, but there was no turning back now.